Tonight we dive into a world where your wealth walked on four legs and mooed back at you. Welcome to medieval Scotland, where cattle weren't just livestock, they were the beating heart of an entire economic system, the foundation of clan power, and the currency that could make or break kingdoms. In the misty highlands of Scotland, from the 9th to the 15th centuries, something extraordinary was happening. While other regions struggled with the complexities of early monetary systems, Scottish clans had perfected something far more ingenious. They had created a living, breathing economy where a man's worth wasn't measured in silver coins, but in the number of cattle that grazed on his lands. This wasn't just farming. This was survival, politics, and economics rolled into one magnificent, chaotic system that would shape the very identity of Scotland itself. Before we start, consider subscribing to the channel. So settle in for a journey back to a time when wealth had hooves, when fortunes could walk away on their own, and when the fate of entire clans hung on the successful completion of a single cattle raid under the light of a Highland moon. Chapter 1: Barter Economy. Imagine waking up in the year 1150, deep in the Scottish Highlands. The morning mist clings to the heather like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in the distance, you hear the soft lowing of cattle. But this isn't just any pastoral scene. This is the heartbeat of an entire civilization. Long before the clinking of coins would echo through Scottish valleys, the Highland clans had developed something far more sophisticated than simple bartering. They had created what historians now recognize as one of the most complex non-monetary economies in medieval Europe. While King David I was busy minting Scotland's first silver pennies in far-off Carlisle around 1136, the Highland clans were already operating a financial system that would make modern economists weep with its elegant simplicity. But let's step back even further to understand how this all began. Picture Scotland in the 9th and 10th centuries. This was a land of warring kingdoms, where survival meant strength and strength meant numbers. Not numbers of soldiers necessarily, but numbers of cattle. The ancient Gaelic term "sprayed" meant both cattle and wealth, and this wasn't mere linguistic coincidence. In Highland society, these concepts were so intertwined that separating them was like trying to separate the mist from the mountains. The genius of the Highland barter system lay not in its simplicity, but in its complexity. This wasn't the crude trading of one cow for 2 sheep that we might imagine. No, this was a sophisticated network of obligations, relationships, and economic calculations that would rival any modern financial instrument. Every transaction was a thread in an elaborate tapestry of clan relationships, bound by honor, tradition, and the very real threat of violence. Consider the morning routine of a Highland farmer in the 12th century. He wouldn't check his bank balance because there was no bank. He wouldn't count his coins because he likely had none. Instead, he would walk out to his fields and count his cattle, his sheep, his goats. Each animal represented not just meat or milk, but purchasing power, political influence, and social status all rolled into one woolly, mooing package. The seasonal rhythms of this economy were as predictable as the Highland weather was unpredictable. Spring brought the movement of cattle to higher pastures, a practice called transhumance that was both economic necessity and social ritual. Young men and women would accompany the herds to the mountain shielings, those temporary stone and turf shelters that dotted the Highland landscape like ancient outposts of civilization. These weren't simply farming expeditions. They were economic missions of the highest importance. In the summer pastures, cattle would fatten on the rich mountain grass, increasing their value with every passing day. The milk would be turned into cheese and butter, both valuable trade commodities that could be stored through the winter months. Even the journey itself had economic value, as the drovers would trade with other clans along the way, exchanging not just cattle and goods, but information about prices, politics, and potential threats. The beauty of this system was its self-regulating nature. Unlike coins, which could be hoarded or devalued by distant kings, cattle were inherently honest currency. A cow was a cow, regardless of which clan claimed ownership. It provided milk it could reproduce, and in times of desperation it could feed a family. This wasn't abstract wealth stored in some distant vault. This was wealth you could touch, wealth that looked back at you with big brown eyes. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Highland barter economy was how it created and maintained social relationships. Every transaction was personal. When Clan MacLeod traded cattle to Clan MacDonald, they weren't just exchanging livestock. They were creating bonds of obligation, debts of honor, and networks of mutual dependence that could last for generations. The arrival of coins to the Highlands wasn't greeted with the enthusiasm you might expect. When the first silver pennies bearing the image of David began to appear in Highland markets around the mid-12th century, many clan members viewed them with deep suspicion. What good were these cold, lifeless discs compared to the warm flanks of a Highland cow? You couldn't milk a coin, you couldn't breed it, and if times got truly desperate, you certainly couldn't eat it. This resistance to monetary currency wasn't ignorance or stubbornness. It was a recognition that their cattle-based system offered something that coins never could: security, sustainability, and social cohesion. In a world where political alliances shifted like Highland weather, where kings rose and fell with alarming regularity, cattle represented stability. They were wealth that moved, wealth that grew, wealth that could adapt to any circumstance. The clan elders understood something that would take economists centuries to rediscover. That money is ultimately about trust, and nothing built trust like the shared experience of driving cattle together across treacherous mountain passes, of sharing the risks and rewards of the grazing seasons, of standing together to defend the herds from raiders and wolves. As we settle into this long night's journey through Highland history, remember that what we're really exploring isn't just an economic system. We're uncovering the very DNA of Scottish clan culture, the invisible bonds that held together a society that would survive invasions, clearances, and centuries of change. And at the heart of it all, lowing softly in the Highland mist, were the cattle that made it all possible. The transition was gradual, like the slow change from summer to winter in the Highlands. As the 12th century progressed, coins began to appear alongside cattle in Highland transactions, but rather than replacing the old system, they simply became another element in the complex web of Highland economics. A debt might be paid in part with cattle, in part with silver, and in part with promises of future service. This wasn't economic confusion. This was economic sophistication of the highest order. In the quiet moments between transactions, between the seasonal movements of cattle, between the endless cycles of birth and death and renewal that marked Highland life, something profound was happening. A culture was defining itself not through conquest or conversion, but through commerce. The way the Highland clans chose to exchange value said everything about who they were, what they valued, and how they saw their place in the world. And as the mist rolls across the heather and the cattle settle in for the night, we catch a glimpse of something that would define Scotland for centuries to come. The understanding that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you're willing to share. The cattle economy of the Highland clans wasn't just about survival. It was about building a society where honor mattered more than gold, where relationships were more valuable than any treasure, and where the lowing of cattle in the morning mist was the sound of civilization itself. Chapter 2: Cattle as Currency. Deep in the heart of a Highland winter, when snow blocks the mountain passes and the wind howls like ancient spirits, imagine sitting by a peat fire listening to the clan storyteller weave tales of wealth and power. But these weren't stories of golden hoards or silver treasures. These were stories of cattle, the living currency that made some clans mighty and left others struggling to survive. The concept of cattle as currency in medieval Scotland was far more sophisticated than modern minds might grasp. This wasn't simply a case of trading cows like oversized coins. The Highland clans had developed what amounted to a complex financial system with its own exchange rates, credit arrangements, and even sophisticated methods of wealth storage that would make any modern banker nod in grudging admiration. Consider the mathematical beauty of it all. A prime Highland bull might be worth 10 milk cows, which in turn might equal 20 sheep, which could be exchanged for 40 goats, which might purchase 2 fine horses. But these weren't fixed exchange rates carved in stone. They fluctuated based on season, quality, age, and dozens of other factors that Highland farmers calculated with the precision of stock market traders. The seasonal variations alone would make your head spin. A cow heavy with calf in spring commanded a premium that could double its winter value. A bull proven as a good breeder might be worth more than 20 ordinary cattle. Elderly cows, past their prime for breeding but still good for milk, had their own market niche. Young calves represented potential, priced not for what they were, but for what they might become. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The Highland clans didn't just use cattle as currency for major transactions. They had developed a complete monetary system with cattle at the center. Small denominations might be handled with sheep or goats. Medium transactions involved milk cows or young bulls. The truly significant deals, the ones that could change the fate of entire clans, these were conducted in prime breeding cattle, each animal worth more than a lowland farmer might see in a lifetime. The storage of this living wealth created challenges that would never occur with metallic currency. You couldn't simply bury cattle in the ground and dig them up years later. Cattle required constant care, feeding, protection from predators and raiders. This meant that wealth in Highland society was inherently active. You couldn't be a passive investor in the cattle economy. Your wealth demanded daily attention, seasonal movement, and constant vigilance. This active nature of cattle wealth created something remarkable. It made economic inequality both more visible and more temporary than in monetary systems. A clan chief's wealth grazed openly on the hills where everyone could see it. There was no hiding your cattle in secret vaults. If your herds thrived, everyone knew you were prosperous. If disease or raiders struck, your poverty was equally obvious. But cattle wealth was also remarkably resilient. Unlike coins that could be stolen in a single raid, cattle were dispersed across wide territories. A clever chief might spread his herds across multiple glens, ensuring that no single disaster could wipe out his entire fortune. This distribution also created employment. as each herd required shepherds, guards, and managers, spreading the benefits of wealth throughout the clan's structure. The breeding aspect of cattle currency created something that coins could never match: compound interest that literally walked around on four legs. A wise investment in prime breeding stock could multiply dramatically over just a few years. A single bull might father dozens of calves, each representing a return on the original investment. This biological multiplication factor meant that highland wealth could grow exponentially, but it also meant it could disappear just as quickly through disease, harsh winters, or enemy raids. The quality assessment of cattle currency required expertise that took decades to develop. Highland farmers became walking encyclopedias of cattle knowledge, able to judge an animal's worth by the width of its back, the glossiness of its coat, the brightness of its eyes, the firmness of its step. They could estimate a cow's age by examining its teeth, predict its breeding potential by observing its behavior, and assess its health by a dozen subtle signs that escaped untrained eyes. This expertise created its own economic class: the cattle assessors, men whose judgment could make or break a transaction. When disputes arose over the value of animals used in payment, these experts would be called in to render judgment. Their word carried the weight of law, and their reputation for fairness could make them wealthy and influential members of clan society. The psychological aspects of cattle currency were profound in ways that modern economists are only beginning to understand. Unlike abstract money, cattle created emotional bonds between owners and their wealth. Highland farmers didn't just count their cattle, they knew them individually, recognized their personalities, mourned their deaths, and celebrated their births. This emotional connection to wealth created a different relationship with money than exists in monetary systems. These emotional bonds also created what we might call wealth anxiety, unique to the cattle economy. A Highland farmer might wake in the night worrying not about market fluctuations or bank failures, but about whether his prize bull had wandered too far from home, whether that cough he'd heard from his best milk cow meant illness, or whether raiders might be planning an attack on his herds. The insurance systems that developed around cattle wealth were remarkably sophisticated. Clans developed informal networks of mutual protection, agreeing to help each other recover stolen cattle, to share breeding stock when disease struck, to provide emergency grazing during harsh seasons. These weren't formal contracts written on parchment. These were honor bonds, sealed with handshakes and maintained through generations of mutual obligation. The lending and borrowing of cattle created credit systems that operated on timescales unknown in monetary economies. A young man might borrow a cow from his chief, agreeing to return 2 cattle in 5 years' time. This wasn't usury, it was investment in human potential. The borrower gained the means to start building his own herd, while the lender received a return that accounted for the natural increase of cattle over time. These cattle loans often came with complex conditions that resembled modern financial instruments. The borrower might be required to provide the first year's milk to the lender, or to give the lender first choice of any calves born to the borrowed cow. Some loans required the borrower to provide labor during busy seasons, creating relationships that blended finance, employment, and social obligation in ways that would baffle modern economists. The international aspects of cattle currency created some of the earliest forms of foreign exchange in Scottish history. When Highland cattle were driven south to lowland markets, They had to be converted to silver or gold for trade with merchants who didn't understand the cattle system. This created a class of highland brokers who specialized in currency conversion, men who understood both the cattle values of the North and the monetary systems of the South. These brokers became crucial figures in Highland economics, serving as bridges between two incompatible financial worlds. They would accept payment in cattle from Highland clans, then convert that wealth to coins for trade with lowland merchants, keeping a percentage for their services. Their success depended on their ability to predict price movements in both cattle and monetary markets, making them perhaps Scotland's first international currency traders. As we drift deeper into this exploration of Highland finance, surrounded by the soft sounds of cattle settling for the night, we begin to understand that what we're really examining isn't just an economic system. We're looking at a completely different philosophy of wealth, value, and human relationships. In the Highland cattle economy, money wasn't an abstract concept divorced from daily life. Money was life itself, grazing peacefully on the hillsides, providing milk for breakfast, and promising security for future generations. The transition from this living currency to the cold abstraction of coins represented more than just economic change. It was a fundamental shift in how people related to wealth, to each other, and to the land itself. But that transition would take centuries, and in the meantime, the Highland clans continued to perfect their remarkable system of four-legged finance, creating in the process a civilization unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Chapter 3: Clan Wealth. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Highland glen, while the rest of the world still slumbers, the sounds that matter most aren't the rustle of coins or the scratch of accounting ledgers. They're the gentle breathing of cattle, the soft shuffle of hooves on grass, and the distant call of a herder checking his charges. This is the treasury of a Highland clan, scattered across miles of mountain pasture, watched over by men whose very lives depend on keeping accurate count of the four-legged fortune that represents their people's survival. Clan wealth in medieval Scotland was measured not in the weight of silver in strongboxes, but in the movement of black cattle across heather-covered hills. A clan chief's true power could be calculated by adding up the lowing, breathing, milk-producing assets that dotted his territories like living coins in a vast, open-air bank. But understanding clan wealth means understanding that this wasn't just about economics. This was about identity, honor, survival, and the complex social structures that held Highland society together through centuries of conflict and change. The accumulation of clan wealth followed patterns that would seem utterly foreign to modern financial advisors. Imagine trying to explain to a Wall Street broker that the most valuable assets required daily feeding, could wander away if not properly supervised, and might die unexpectedly from disease or predator attacks. Yet this system produced some of the most stable and prosperous societies in medieval Europe, creating wealth that sustained Highland clans through wars, famines, and political upheavals that toppled kingdoms. The hierarchy of clan wealth was as complex as any modern corporate structure, but infinitely more personal. At the apex sat the clan chief, whose cattle holdings might number in the thousands, spread across multiple glens and managed by a network of trusted kinsmen. These weren't just agricultural assets. They were symbols of the chief's ability to protect and provide for his people, tangible proof of his worthiness to lead. Below the chief came the tacksmen, that crucial middle class of Highland society who served as both estate managers and military officers. A successful tacksman might own several hundred cattle, enough to support a comfortable lifestyle and maintain his own household of servants and dependents. The tacksman's wealth was often measured not just in the cattle he owned outright, but in his skill at managing the chief's herds, taking a percentage of the profits as payment for his services. The ordinary clansmen, the farmers and herders who formed the backbone of Highland society, measured their wealth in dozens rather than hundreds of cattle. But even a small herd of 20 or 30 cattle represented significant wealth in Highland terms, enough to support a family, pay rent to the chief, and maintain the social obligations that bound clan society together. A man with no cattle was truly poor in Highland terms, dependent on the charity of his kinsmen for survival. But clan wealth wasn't just about individual holdings. The genius of the Highland system lay in its communal aspects, the ways in which individual wealth was woven into larger patterns of mutual obligation and support. The clan's collective wealth included not just the cattle owned by individual members, but also the common grazing lands, the shared knowledge of breeding and herding, and the military strength that protected all clan assets from external threats. The seasonal cycles of clan wealth creation followed patterns as old as Scotland itself. Spring brought the selection of breeding stock, crucial decisions that would determine the clan's prosperity for years to come. The choice of which bulls to retain, which cows to breed, which animals to trade away required expertise passed down through generations of Highland farmers, knowledge that was literally worth its weight in gold. Summer was the season of growth, when cattle fattened on rich mountain pastures and produced the milk that would be turned into cheese and butter for winter storage. The annual migration to the summer sheilings wasn't just about finding better grazing. It was about maximizing the return on the clan's bovine investments, ensuring that every animal reached its full economic potential. Autumn brought the great reckonings, when herds were counted, surplus animals selected for trade or slaughter, and preparations made for the harsh Highland winter. This was when clan accountants, armed with nothing more than their memories and perhaps a few notched sticks, would calculate the year's gains and losses with an accuracy that would impress any modern CPA. Winter was the season of survival, when clan wealth was literally consumed to keep people alive through the dark months. The cattle slaughtered in autumn provided meat, their hides became leather for clothing and equipment, their bones were crafted into tools and ornaments. Nothing was wasted in the Highland economy. Every part of the clan's bovine wealth served multiple purposes. The breeding programs developed by Highland clans represented some of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of genetic selection in human history. Clan chiefs would invest tremendous resources in acquiring superior breeding stock, sometimes trading away dozens of ordinary cattle for a single exceptional bull. These prize animals became the genetic foundation for entire herds, their bloodlines carefully tracked through generations of Highland cattle. The knowledge required to manage these breeding programs was passed down through clan bloodlines like state secrets. Families specialized in different aspects of cattle husbandry, becoming renowned throughout the Highlands for their expertise with particular breeds or bloodlines. This specialized knowledge became a form of intellectual property, jealously guarded and carefully transmitted from father to son. The social aspects of clan wealth extended far beyond simple economics. A clan's cattle represented not just monetary value, but social capital, political influence, and cultural identity. The ability to host a feast featuring beef from the clan's own herds was a demonstration of wealth and hospitality that resonated throughout Highland society. The quality of cattle presented as gifts or tribute sent clear messages about the giver's respect for the recipient. The defensive aspects of clan wealth created unique challenges and opportunities. Unlike coins that could be hidden in vaults, cattle were inherently vulnerable to raiders and thieves. This vulnerability created a form of wealth that required constant protection, turning every Highland clan into a military organization dedicated to defending its economic assets. But this same vulnerability also created opportunities for rapid wealth accumulation through successful raiding. A well-planned cattle raid could double a clan's wealth overnight, while a successful defense against raiders could enhance a clan's reputation and attract new members seeking the protection of a strong leader. This created a dynamic system where wealth, military prowess, and political power were intimately connected. The insurance and risk management systems developed by Highland clans were remarkably sophisticated, based on principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. When disease struck one clan's herds, neighboring clans would provide breeding stock to help rebuild the losses. When raiders struck, the entire clan network would mobilize to recover stolen cattle and punish the thieves. These mutual aid systems created what modern economists would recognize as diversified investment portfolios, but spread across social networks rather than financial markets. A wise clan chief would maintain relationships with distant clans, exchange cattle and breeding rights, and participate in the complex networks of obligation and reciprocity that provided insurance against catastrophic losses. The measurement and assessment of clan wealth required skills that combined the precision of accounting with the intuition of livestock breeding. Highland experts could judge the value of an entire herd at a glance, calculating not just current worth but future potential based on breeding prospects, pasture quality, and seasonal factors. This expertise was so valued that cattle assessors became wealthy and influential figures in Highland society. The record-keeping systems used by Highland clans were based entirely on human memory, supplemented by simple physical tokens like notched sticks or pebbles. Yet these systems tracked thousands of animals across vast territories with remarkable accuracy. Clan genealogists didn't just memorize human family trees, they maintained detailed mental records of cattle bloodlines stretching back generations. As the first hints of dawn begin to lighten the Highland sky and the cattle stir in their pastures, we begin to see that clan wealth was never just about accumulating assets. It was about creating and maintaining the complex social, economic, and cultural systems that allowed Highland society to thrive in one of Europe's most challenging environments. The lowing of cattle in the morning mist wasn't just the sound of livestock. It was the sound of a civilization that had learned to turn its greatest challenges into its greatest strengths. The true measure of clan wealth lay not in any single chief's holdings, but in the resilience and adaptability of the entire system. Through centuries of warfare, political upheaval, and economic change, the Highland clans maintained their cattle-based wealth systems because these systems did more than just create prosperity. They created community, identity, and a way of life that would define Scottish culture for generations to come. Chapter 4: Raids and Trade. The moon hangs like a silver coin above the highland peaks, casting shadows that dance and shift across the heather. But tonight, those shadows hide more than sleeping sheep and browsing deer. Tonight, they conceal men moving silently through the glens, their eyes fixed not on conquest or glory, but on the ultimate prize of highland society: cattle, the four-legged currency that could make or break a clan's fortunes with a single successful raid. The relationship between raiding and trade in medieval Scotland was far more complex than simple theft and commerce. To understand Highland society, you must understand that cattle raiding wasn't considered criminal activity in the way modern minds might perceive it. It was economic warfare, political statement, and cultural ritual all wrapped together in a practice the Gaelic speakers called creech, a word that carried connotations of both strategic acquisition and honorable contest. Picture the planning that went into a major cattle raid. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made by desperate men. This was a military strategy applied to economic objectives, requiring intelligence gathering, route planning, timing coordination, and risk assessment that would impress any modern business strategist. The raiders needed to know not just where the cattle were grazing, but also the strength of the defending forces, the political relationships between clans, and the complex web of obligations that might bring unexpected allies to their enemies' aid. The seasonal patterns of raiding followed the rhythms of Highland life as predictably as the migration of birds. Autumn was the peak season for cattle raids, when herds were fat from summer grazing, but before they were moved to winter shelters closer to clan strongholds. The timing wasn't just about maximizing the value of stolen cattle. It was about striking when the political costs were lowest and the chances of successful escape were highest. The logistics of moving stolen cattle across Highland terrain required skills that combined military tactics with advanced animal husbandry. Raiders had to move hundreds of animals across treacherous mountain passes while avoiding pursuit, all while keeping the cattle healthy enough to be valuable at the end of the journey. The droving skills developed for legitimate trade were essential for successful raiding, creating a symbiotic relationship between legal and illegal cattle movement. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating. The line between raiding and trade was often blurred beyond recognition. What began as a cattle raid might end as a negotiated settlement. What started as legitimate trade might involve cattle that had been acquired through questionable means. The Highland economy operated on principles of reciprocity and honor that made simple categories like legal and illegal almost meaningless. The cultural aspects of cattle raiding elevated it far above simple theft. A successful raid was seen as proof of courage, tactical skill, and leadership ability. Young men proved their worth to their clans by participating in raids, while experienced warriors enhanced their reputations through particularly daring or skillful operations. The stories of great raids were preserved in oral tradition alongside tales of battles and heroic deeds. The economic calculations involved in raiding were surprisingly sophisticated. Raiders had to weigh the potential gains against the risks of retaliation, the costs of organizing and equipping an expedition, and the political consequences of targeting particular clans. A successful raid might bring immediate wealth, but it could also trigger a cycle of counter-raids that might ultimately prove more costly than beneficial. The defensive measures developed by Highland clans in response to raiding created some of the most innovative security systems of the medieval world. Cattle were often kept in remote glens during vulnerable seasons, guarded by networks of sentries who could communicate across vast distances using horn calls and beacon fires. The famous Highland hospitality wasn't just cultural tradition, it was intelligence gathering, as travelers might carry crucial information about rival clans' cattle movements. The retaliation systems that evolved around cattle raiding created a form of economic warfare that could span generations. The hot trod, the legal right to pursue raiders across clan boundaries within 6 days of a theft, created a formalized system for cattle recovery that operated alongside or instead of formal legal proceedings. But the hot trod could also escalate conflicts, turning simple cattle theft into full-scale clan warfare. The trading aspects of the Highland cattle economy operated on principles that would seem alien to modern commercial law. Trust was based not on contracts or legal guarantees, but on family honor, clan reputation, and the certainty of violent retaliation for breaches of agreement. A handshake between clan chiefs could seal deals worth thousands of cattle, backed by the understanding that betrayal would mean war. The great cattle fairs that developed throughout Scotland served as neutral ground where traditional enemies could meet to trade without the constant threat of raiding. These markets operated under complex systems of temporary truce, enforced by powerful neutral clans or religious authorities who guaranteed safe passage for all participants. The economic benefits of trade often outweighed the potential gains from raiding, creating temporary peace in otherwise violent relationships. The pricing mechanisms used in Highland cattle trade were based on factors that went far beyond simple supply and demand. The reputation of the seller, the bloodline of the cattle, the political situation between clans, and even the season of the year all influenced the final price. A cow sold by a trusted ally might command a premium, while cattle offered by a traditional enemy might be discounted due to suspicion about their origins. The credit systems that developed around cattle trade created some of the earliest forms of international finance in Scottish history. Highland traders would advance cattle to southern markets on the promise of future payment, creating debt relationships that could span multiple seasons and involve complex currency conversions between cattle values and monetary prices. The transportation networks created by cattle trading and raiding carved permanent pathways through the Highland landscape. The famous drive roads that crisscrossed Scotland weren't built by government engineers. They were created by countless generations of cattle traders and raiders who found the most efficient routes through challenging terrain. These pathways became the circulatory system of Highland commerce, carrying not just cattle, but also news, culture, and political influence throughout the region. The international aspects of Highland cattle trade created Scotland's first major export industry. Highland cattle were prized throughout Europe for their hardiness and quality, creating trade relationships that brought foreign currency and exotic goods into Highland society. But this international trade also made Highland clans vulnerable to external economic forces, as changes in foreign markets could dramatically affect the value of their cattle holdings. The legal frameworks that evolved around cattle raiding and trading created a parallel system of justice that operated alongside formal Scottish law. Clan courts would hear disputes about cattle ownership, assess compensation for raid damages, and negotiate the complex settlements that often resolved conflicts without resort to violence. These informal legal systems were remarkably effective, based on community knowledge and social pressure rather than written law and formal punishment. The intelligence networks created by raiding and trading activities made Highland clans some of the best-informed societies in medieval Europe. Information about cattle movements, political alliances, military preparations, and economic opportunities flowed along the same channels that carried legitimate trade and planned raids. Clan chiefs often knew more about events in distant regions than did formal government officials. The military innovations driven by the need to protect and acquire cattle created tactical developments that would influence Scottish warfare for centuries. The famous Highland Charge, the development of guerrilla warfare tactics, and the emphasis on speed and mobility over heavy armor all evolved from the requirements of cattle raiding and defense. The social stratification within Highland clans was heavily influenced by success in raiding and trading activities. Young men who proved themselves in cattle raids could rise rapidly in clan hierarchy, while those who showed skill in legitimate trade could accumulate wealth and influence that transcended their birth status. This created a relatively fluid social system where merit and achievement mattered more than pure genealogy. As the night deepens and the raiders slip back into the shadows with their four-legged prizes, we begin to understand that cattle raiding and trading weren't separate activities, but different aspects of the same economic system. In Highland society, the line between war and commerce, between legal and illegal acquisition, between honorable competition and outright theft, was drawn not by abstract legal principles, but by complex social relationships, clan loyalties, and the endless pursuit of the living wealth that grazed on Highland hills. The stories of great raiders and canny traders became part of Highland oral tradition, passed down through generations alongside clan genealogies and territorial claims. These weren't just tales of adventure and profit. They were the foundational myths of a society that understood that in a harsh and unforgiving environment, survival often depended on the willingness to take calculated risks, whether those risks involved negotiating with traditional enemies or creeping through moonlit glens in pursuit of four-legged fortune. Chapter 5: Shift to Coins. The changing of ages rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it creeps in like morning mist, slowly obscuring familiar landmarks until suddenly the world looks entirely different. Such was the case in medieval Scotland, where the gradual shift from cattle currency to coined money represented not just an economic transformation, but a fundamental change in how Scottish society understood wealth, power, and human relationships. King David I's introduction of Scotland's first silver pennies in 1136 marked the beginning of the end for the cattle-based economy that had sustained Highland clans for centuries. But like all profound historical changes, this transition was neither immediate nor uniform. For generations, silver coins and Highland cattle would coexist in an uneasy partnership, creating a dual economy that reflected the deep cultural divisions between Lowland and Highland Scotland. Picture the confusion that must have greeted the first appearance of these strange silver discs in Highland markets. Here were objects that claimed to represent value but possessed no intrinsic worth beyond the metal from which they were made. They couldn't be milked, they couldn't reproduce, and they certainly couldn't feed a family through a harsh Highland winter. To people accustomed to wealth that lowered and moved and breathed, these coins must have seemed like sorcery. The resistance to monetary currency in Highland society wasn't based on ignorance or conservative stubbornness. It was based on a sophisticated understanding of what made currency reliable and trustworthy. Highland clan members had developed their cattle-based economy over centuries, creating systems of value assessment, credit arrangement, and wealth storage that had proven their worth through countless economic crises. Why abandon a system that worked in favor of untested foreign innovations? The practical advantages of cattle over coins were obvious to any Highland farmer. Cattle provided multiple forms of return on investment: milk for daily sustenance, hides for leather, meat for special occasions, and offspring that represented biological compound interest. Coins, by contrast, were inert lumps of metal that produced nothing, required no care, and offered no return beyond their face value. But the political implications of currency choice ran even deeper than economic considerations. The adoption of royal coinage represented acceptance of central authority, acknowledgement that the Scottish king had the right to define value and regulate commerce. For Highland clans that had maintained their independence for centuries, using royal coins was tantamount to political submission. The geographic distribution of early Scottish coins tells a fascinating story about the uneven spread of monetary currency. Archaeological evidence shows that coins were common in lowland burghs and royal castles, but remained rare in Highland territories for decades after their introduction. This wasn't simply a matter of remote locations being slow to adopt new technologies. It was evidence of deliberate resistance by Highland communities to external economic control. The early Scottish coins themselves reflected the hybrid nature of David I's kingdom. While the coins bore the king's image and Latin inscriptions, they were often made from silver mined in territories that still operated largely on cattle-based economics. The Alston silver mines that provided metal for Scottish pennies were worked by communities that might never use the coins they helped create. The gradual acceptance of coins in Highland society followed patterns that reflected the complex relationships between clans and central authority. Coins first appeared in transactions with lowland merchants, who refused to accept cattle as payment. Highland traders learned to convert their bovine wealth to metallic currency for these specific transactions, then convert back to cattle for use within their own communities. The exchange rates between cattle and coins created Scotland's first foreign exchange markets, operated by brokers who specialized in currency conversion. These entrepreneurs became crucial figures in Highland commerce, serving as bridges between incompatible economic systems. Their success depended on their ability to predict fluctuations in both cattle and coin values, making them perhaps Scotland's first professional currency traders. The taxation systems imposed by Scottish kings created additional pressure for Highland adoption of monetary currency. Royal tax collectors found it much easier to assess and collect taxes in standardized coins rather than attempting to evaluate the varying qualities and values of cattle offered as payment. This administrative convenience gradually forced Highland clans to acquire coins specifically for tax payments, even when they continued to use cattle for all other transactions. The legal framework surrounding monetary currency created new forms of economic crime that were unknown in cattle-based systems. Counterfeiting coins became a problem that required new laws, new enforcement mechanisms, and new forms of punishment. By contrast, cattle fraud was virtually impossible, You either had a cow or you didn't, and the quality of any animal was immediately apparent to experienced evaluators. The storage and security challenges posed by coins created problems that Highland society was ill-equipped to handle. Cattle could be hidden in remote glens and watched over by armed herders, but coins required secure vaults, trusted guardians, and sophisticated security systems. The development of coin hoarding created new forms of wealth inequality, as those with secure storage could accumulate monetary wealth while those without remained vulnerable to theft. The lending and borrowing systems that evolved around monetary currency were fundamentally different from cattle-based credit arrangements. Coins could be lent at fixed interest rates, creating mathematical relationships between time and money that were unknown in biological systems, where loans were repaid through natural increase. This mathematical precision made monetary lending both more predictable and more impersonal than cattle loans. The international implications of Scotland's adoption of coined money were profound. Standardized currency made trade with other European kingdoms much easier, opening new markets for Scottish goods and allowing Scottish merchants to participate in international commerce. But this international integration also made Scotland vulnerable to external economic forces that were beyond the control of any individual clan or even the Scottish crown. The social changes accompanying the shift to monetary currency were subtle but far-reaching. Coins could be accumulated in ways that cattle never could, creating new forms of wealth inequality. A successful merchant could hoard thousands of coins in a secure vault, while cattle wealth was naturally limited by the carrying capacity of available grazing land. This unlimited accumulation potential changed the very nature of wealth and social stratification. The psychological impact of the transition from living to inert currency cannot be underestimated. Highland farmers who had spent their lives caring for animals that they knew individually suddenly found themselves dealing with identical metallic objects that carried no emotional weight or personal history. This emotional disconnection from wealth had profound implications for how people related to money and material possessions. The military implications of monetary currency were equally significant. Coins could be used to hire professional soldiers, creating armies that were loyal to whoever paid their wages rather than to clan or family bonds. This monetization of military service weakened traditional clan structures and created new forms of political power based on financial rather than feudal relationships. The religious aspects of the currency transition reflected deeper theological questions about the nature of value and divine providence. Highland communities that saw cattle as gifts from God, requiring daily care and seasonal migration in harmony with natural cycles, struggled to understand how coins, created by human hands and bearing royal images, could carry equivalent moral and spiritual weight. The educational requirements of monetary currency created new demands for literacy and numeracy that were largely unknown in cattle-based systems. Successful participation in a coin economy required the ability to read, write, and calculate in ways that were unnecessary when wealth consisted of animals that could be counted and evaluated through direct observation. The generational differences in currency adoption created tensions within Highland families and clans. Older generations, raised in the cattle tradition, often viewed coins with suspicion and continued to prefer livestock transactions when possible. Younger generations, seeing the advantages of portable, divisible currency, gradually embraced monetary systems. These generational divisions reflected deeper questions about cultural identity and economic modernization. The regional variations in currency adoption created a patchwork of economic systems across Scotland. Some areas maintained pure cattle economies for centuries after coins were introduced, while others adopted mixed systems that used both forms of currency depending on the type of transaction. Still others embraced monetary currency quickly and completely, abandoning cattle-based systems within a generation. As dawn breaks over the Highland landscape and the mist begins to lift from the glens, we can see the profound transformation that monetary currency brought to Scottish society. The shift from cattle to coins represented more than just a change in payment methods. It was a fundamental reordering of how people understood value, wealth, and economic relationships. The lowing of cattle in the morning pastures would continue for centuries, but gradually, it would be joined and eventually overshadowed by the clink of coins in merchant purses and the scratch of accounting ledgers in royal treasuries. The living, breathing economy of the Highland clans had served Scotland well through its formative centuries, but the future belonged to the cold precision of monetary calculation and the unlimited accumulation potential of metallic wealth. Yet something essential was lost in this transition, something that Highland communities understood intuitively even if they couldn't always articulate it clearly. The cattle economy had been sustainable, personal, and deeply connected to the natural rhythms of Highland life. The monetary economy that replaced it would prove more efficient and more flexible, but also more vulnerable to external manipulation and more disconnected from the land and culture that had created Highland society. The shift to coins marked not just the end of an economic era, but the beginning of Scotland's integration into wider European commercial networks that would ultimately transform the kingdom beyond recognition. In the quiet moments between the old economy and the new, between the last cattle transaction and the first purely monetary exchange, Scotland balanced on the knife's edge between tradition and modernity, between independence and integration, between the ancient ways of the clans and the emerging world of kings and kingdoms. As our journey through the misty glens of Highland economics draws to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of past and present, gazing back at a world where wealth had legs and currency came with its own built-in insurance policy through reproduction. The story of Scottish clans' cattle currency represents far more than just an interesting historical footnote. It reveals fundamental truths about human nature, economic systems, and the relationship between culture and commerce that remain relevant in our digital age. The Highland cattle economy wasn't simply a primitive precursor to modern financial systems. It was a sophisticated, sustainable, and remarkably resilient approach to wealth creation and distribution that solved problems our contemporary economy still struggles with. In a world increasingly concerned about environmental sustainability, economic inequality, and the disconnection between financial abstractions and real value, the Highland model offers insights that transcend its historical context. Consider the sustainability aspects of cattle currency. Unlike paper money or digital transactions that consume resources without creating tangible value, cattle currency was inherently productive. Every unit of currency provided milk, eventually meat, and naturally reproduced itself, creating a system where wealth generation was directly tied to biological and environmental health. The Highland clans had created what modern economists might call a circular economy, where waste was minimized and every element served multiple purposes. The social dimensions of cattle currency created bonds between people and their wealth that are entirely missing from contemporary financial systems. Highland farmers didn't just own their cattle, they knew them individually, understood their personalities, and shared their daily lives. This personal connection to wealth created a different relationship with money, one based on care, responsibility, and long-term thinking rather than short-term speculation and abstract accumulation. The geographic distribution requirements of cattle wealth created natural limits on inequality that don't exist in monetary systems. You couldn't hoard infinite cattle in a single location. The animals required dispersed grazing, multiple herders, and constant movement. This natural distribution mechanism meant that clan wealth automatically created employment, spread benefits throughout the community, and remained visible to all members of society. The resilience of the Highland cattle economy through centuries of warfare, political upheaval, and natural disasters offers lessons for contemporary discussions about economic stability. While kingdoms rose and fell, currencies were devalued, and trade routes were disrupted, Highland clans maintained their cattle-based prosperity because their wealth was inherently adaptive, mobile, and self-sustaining. The transition from cattle to coins that began in the 12th century marked not just an economic transformation, but a fundamental shift in human consciousness about the nature of value itself. The adoption of abstract currency divorced wealth from its tangible origins, creating possibilities for both greater efficiency and greater instability that continue to shape our economic systems today. The Highland model demonstrates that successful economies don't necessarily require central banks, formal regulatory structures, or complex financial instruments. Instead, they can be based on mutual trust, shared cultural values, and direct relationships between people and the sources of their prosperity. The clan system created its own regulatory mechanisms through honor codes, mutual obligations, and community oversight that proved remarkably effective at preventing fraud and maintaining stability. The military and political implications of cattle currency created a different kind of power structure than we see in monetary systems. Highland chiefs derived their authority not from accumulated abstract wealth, but from their ability to protect and increase the living assets that sustain their communities. This created leadership models based on competence, courage, and service rather than mere financial accumulation. The environmental integration of Highland cattle economics offers a stark contrast to contemporary systems that often treat natural resources as external costs rather than integral components of wealth creation. Highland clans succeeded because they understood that their prosperity was directly dependent on the health of their land, the quality of their pastures, and the sustainability of their grazing practices. The knowledge systems that supported cattle currency were remarkably sophisticated, based on generations of accumulated wisdom about animal behavior, breeding practices, seasonal patterns, and risk management. This traditional ecological knowledge enabled Highland communities to thrive in challenging environments using renewable resources rather than depleting finite ones. The international dimensions of Highland cattle trade created Scotland's first major export industry and established trading relationships that brought prosperity to remote communities. This demonstrates that sustainable, locally based economic systems aren't necessarily isolationist or limited in scope, but can serve as foundations for broader economic engagement. The gradual displacement of cattle currency by monetary systems represents one of the great unacknowledged losses in human economic history. We traded a system that was personal, sustainable, and deeply integrated with natural and social environments for one that is abstract, potentially unlimited, and often disconnected from real value creation. Yet the Highland experience also demonstrates that economic systems must adapt to changing circumstances. The cattle economy that served Highland clans so well for centuries eventually proved inadequate for Scotland's integration into broader European political and commercial networks. The transition to monetary currency, however costly in cultural terms, enabled Scotland to participate in developments that ultimately enriched the entire nation. The lessons of Highland cattle currency remain relevant for contemporary discussions about alternative economic models, local currencies, sustainable development, and the relationship between economy and community. As we face challenges of environmental degradation, economic inequality, and social fragmentation, the Highland example reminds us that successful economies can be built on very different foundations than those we take for granted today. The story we've traced through these Highland glens isn't just about the past, it's about possibilities for the future. In a world increasingly dominated by abstract financial instruments and digital transactions, the Highland cattle economy reminds us that real wealth comes from real value creation, that sustainable prosperity requires harmony between human activity and natural systems, and that the most resilient economies are those that strengthen rather than weaken the communities they serve. As the morning mist finally clears from the Highland valleys and the cattle begin their eternal journey to new pastures, we carry with us the understanding that economics is ultimately about human relationships, cultural values, and the choices we make about how to organize our collective prosperity. The Highland clans chose a path that honored both individual achievement and community welfare, that respected natural limits while encouraging innovation, and that created wealth in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the social and environmental foundations of their society. In our own era of economic uncertainty and environmental challenge, we might do well to remember the lessons of the Highland cattle economy, that true wealth is sustainable wealth, that the best currencies are those that create value rather than merely representing it, and that the most successful economic systems are those that serve human flourishing rather than abstract accumulation. The lowing of cattle in Highland glens may have faded into historical memory, but the wisdom of the system that sustained Scottish civilization for centuries continues to offer insights for anyone willing to listen to the whispered lessons of the wind across the heather. Before we part ways on this journey through Highland history, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever wondered what modern life might look like if we still measured wealth in living, breathing assets rather than digital numbers on screens? Perhaps you've discovered connections between these ancient Highland practices and sustainable economic models in your own community. Share your insights in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation about the timeless relationship between culture, economy, and the land that sustains us all. If this exploration of Highland history has sparked your curiosity about Scotland's rich past, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing and sharing this video with others who might appreciate these forgotten stories of ingenuity and adaptation. Sweet dreams, and may your own wealth, whatever form it takes, be as sustainable and life-giving as the Highland cattle that once grazed peacefully under Scottish stars.